The gavel struck once sharp and final. The estate of Margaret Avery shall remain under guardianship of Charles and Marion Hartman, Judge Cole announced. The courtroom air felt heavy, like someone had just cut off the oxygen. My parents didn't even pretend to hide their satisfaction. My mother's lips curled into that polite social smile she wore at fundraisers, while my father leaned back, adjusting his cufflinks with the confidence of a man who'd already rehearsed his victory. I sat there, frozen hands locked on the edge of the table. The papers in front of me blurred together, the legal jargon meaningless now. The same judge who had rushed every objection from my attorney, who had refused to admit key documents about my grandmother's medical care, had just handed over her life's work to the very people who'd abandoned her. My parents bribed the judge to steal my inheritance. I knew it in my bones, even if I couldn't yet prove it. They smiled as the verdict turned against me, but one man in the courtroom didn't. Across the aisle, sitting behind the bar, a tall man in a dark gray suit watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity. He didn't take notes, didn't whisper to anyone, just observed. When the judge adjourned and the room emptied, he was still there, eyes following my parents as they left, then settling briefly on me. I didn't know it then, but that man, Noah Grant, would become the person who helped expose everything they'd hidden for years. Outside the courthouse, the wind cut through my coat. Denver in early spring still felt like winter, refusing to let go. I pulled my scarf tighter as my parents exited the building, surrounded by their lawyer and a cluster of family friends who'd come to support them. My mother's laughter carried across the plaza light, and carefree the sound of victory. "Liv," my father called, his tone falsely warm. "You really should accept the ruling. It's better this way for everyone." I didn't answer. The phrase "for everyone" had always meant for him. He'd said it when he made me change my college major to business instead of law, when he convinced my grandmother to sign over her company shares for simplified management. And again, now, as if destroying her final wishes was some kind of family favor. My mother stepped closer, her perfume thick and familiar. "You're emotional right now, darling. Margaret wasn't well near the end. She didn't mean for you to bear this alone." I met her gaze, steady but cold. She was in perfect mental health when she wrote her will. You both know that. Her expression didn't change. "Believe what you want. The court has spoken." They turned away together, their silhouettes blending with the gray city skyline. I stood there until their chauffeur-driven SUV disappeared into traffic. That night, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of the case folders, emails, medical reports, bank statements. The official record said my grandmother had altered her will due to declining cognition. Yet every doctor's note I'd seen painted a different picture. She'd been sharp until the last few months, and she'd spoken clearly about wanting me to inherit her townhouse and the small trust she'd built through decades of work. I reached for the framed photo on my desk, Grandma Margaret standing in her garden sunlight, catching the silver in her hair. She'd raised me when my parents were too busy hosting charity galas or managing construction bids. It was her quiet strength that taught me what family was supposed to mean. "Inheritance isn't just money, Liv," she used to say. "It's the truth we leave behind." The memory cracked something open inside me. I realized how quiet my apartment had become. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Then my phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "You were right about the ruling. Look deeper into Judge Cole's financial records. No name, no signature. Just that one cryptic line." My heart pounded. Could it be from one of the courthouse clerks? Or maybe a whistleblower? I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond, but before I could type a single word, the message vanished. Deleted by the sender. Sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's smug expression as the gavel fell. The next morning, I drove to my grandmother's townhouse. A property under dispute sign hung crookedly across the iron gate. I parked across the street and sat in the car, staring at the home that had once smelled of lavender and cinnamon tea. Through the window, I could still picture her in that blue cardigan, sorting through her recipe cards, humming softly. Now, it felt like a crime scene. I got out and walked toward the porch. The front door had been sealed with legal tape. I placed my hand on the cold railing, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost. Not just the house, but the woman who'd believed in me when no one else did. As I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. The mailbox hung open, rain-damp letters inside. Among the usual bills was a small white envelope addressed in my grandmother's handwriting, "For Olivia, only if the truth is taken from you." My throat tightened as I pulled it free. The paper was fragile, the ink faded. I tucked it carefully into my coat pocket before anyone could see. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A black sedan had appeared behind me on the freeway and stayed there for 10 miles before exiting suddenly. Paranoia, maybe, but in that moment I knew the fight wasn't over. Later that day, I returned to the courthouse to pick up some remaining documents. Near the clerk's desk, the man from the courtroom, Noah, stood reading a file. When our eyes met, he gave a polite nod. "You're Margaret Avery's granddaughter, right?" he asked. His voice was calm, steady. That was a rough ruling. "Rough," I repeated bitterly. "That's one way to put it." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You might not know this, but I used to work with the state attorney's office. Judge Cole's decisions have raised eyebrows before. If you're planning to appeal, get someone experienced, someone not afraid of powerful families." "Do you know anyone like that?" I asked, half skeptical, half desperate. He smiled slightly. "Maybe." When I left, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the trial began: hope. That evening, I opened my grandmother's envelope. Inside was a short handwritten note and a small brass key. The note read, "Integrity is the inheritance they can't steal. Use this when the truth feels out of reach." I turned the key over in my palm, puzzled. On the back, engraved faintly, were 2 letters, M.A., her initials. I knew then that somewhere she'd left me something meant to be found only when all else failed. As night fell over Denver, I stood by my window watching the city lights shimmer like a constellation of lies waiting to be uncovered. My parents thought they'd closed every door, sealed every record, silenced every witness. They were wrong. I whispered to the dark, to the woman who'd taught me what justice meant. "You raised me to fight for the truth, Grandma. I will." The promise hung in the stillness of the room, quiet but unbreakable. The brass key caught the morning light. As I turned it between my fingers, its engraved initials, M.A., shimmering faintly. My grandmother's handwriting on the envelope still haunted me. "Integrity is the inheritance they can't steal." The words were both comfort and curse, looping through my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by coffee-stained legal papers. I hadn't slept much since the verdict. The world outside my window looked calm, ordinary, but my family's betrayal pulsed beneath everything like a hidden fault line waiting to crack open again. A faint scent of lavender drifted from the envelope, and suddenly I was 10 years old again, hiding behind my grandmother's kitchen doorway, watching her argue with my father. Their voices had carried through the house that night, hard and brittle. "You can't buy everything, Charles," she said, standing in her robe, clutching a folder against her chest. My father's tone was measured, cold. "I'm not buying, Mother. I'm securing. There's a difference." My grandmother's gaze had burned through him. "One day, Liv will see who you really are." I remember the flicker of fear in my father's eyes before he turned away. It was the first time I'd realized love could sound like war. Back then, the Hartman family name still meant something. My parents were the picture of success. Charles Hartman, the respected construction magnate who built half of Denver's skyline, and Marion Hartman, his beautiful socialite wife, who turned every charity gala into a stage. They taught me that image was everything, that appearances could bury truth. My grandmother, Margaret Avery, believed the opposite. She ran a small community learning foundation, taught local kids to read, and always said power is temporary, integrity lasts. Those two philosophies lived under one roof, like fire and gasoline. My childhood dinners were negotiations, not meals. My father's company was booming, my mother's social circle growing. but my grandmother's quiet defiance was the crack in their flawless portrait. She was the only one who looked me in the eye when she said, "Don't ever let them teach you that kindness is weakness." When I was 17, I saw what she meant. I'd caught my father late at night in his study shredding zoning documents. The sound was slow, deliberate, like he was erasing a memory. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled in that calm way that scared me most. "The world isn't fair, Liv," he said. "We just learn how to win." He patted my shoulder like a coach giving advice, not a man teaching his daughter about deceit. I never forgot it. Months later, the foundation she'd built, the Avery Learning Center, was quietly merged into one of my father's shell corporations. Consolidation, he called it. My grandmother called it theft. They didn't speak for nearly a year after that. The memory clung to me as I looked again at the key. Maybe it opened something in her townhouse, something she'd left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about that line on the half-torn note I'd found in her study the day of the funeral. "If anything happens, look to the rest had been ripped away, leaving only possibility." The funeral itself felt like a performance. I stood in the front pew numb while people I barely knew whispered about how generous Margaret Avery had been. My parents sat in the front row weeping into expensive tissues, their grief staged to perfection. My father's speech was concise, dignified, sterile. My mother devoted her life to family and legacy, he said. "We'll honor her wishes." I knew he meant his version of them. After the service, I watched him whisper something to a man near the church doors, a handshake that lingered too long. I didn't know it then, but that man was Judge Cole. It hit me later, replaying the memory. He was already pulling the strings that would undo her will. At the reception, my mother cornered me near the buffet table, her voice soft and cutting. "You know how much stress she caused your father with that will. Try not to make things harder." She brushed invisible lint off my sleeve as if tidying up her conscience. "You should move on, Olivia. The past can't feed you." I wanted to ask her how peace could be built on lies, but I knew she wouldn't understand the question. 2 days later, we gathered at my grandmother's lawyer's office. Harold Stone was an older man with kind eyes and a deliberate calm that made even silence feel professional. "Your grandmother's wishes were very clear," he said, unfolding the will. "She'd left me the townhouse, her savings, and full control of the Avery Foundation's remaining assets." My father's jaw tightened. My mother's hand went rigid on his knee. "This can't be accurate," Charles interrupted. Mother wasn't mentally sound. Harold adjusted his glasses. She had a full cognitive evaluation less than 2 months before her passing. "I have the records right here." She was confused, my mother added quickly, eyes glossy. "She kept thinking it was 2015 last Christmas." "She remembered your birthday," I said quietly. "She just didn't call." For a moment, nobody spoke. My father looked at me, and I saw at the calculation the same look he gave before a business deal. He wasn't angry. He was planning. When the reading ended, Harold asked to speak with me privately. In his small office lined with framed diplomas, he lowered his voice. "I've known your grandmother for 30 years. She trusted you. I didn't even know she was writing a new will. She didn't want to involve your father. She said something about a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "Influence," he said carefully. "Decisions being managed." She didn't say more, but she asked me to keep a certified copy of this will off-site. I think she suspected someone might try to alter it. That was 3 months before the trial, before Judge Cole's courtroom turned my grandmother's truth into dust. When I returned to the townhouse after the will reading, it already felt different. The garden she loved was overgrown, the porch light removed. Inside furniture had been rearranged, and half her jewelry was gone. My father's assistant later claimed they were being catalogued for probate. In her study, I found a faint outline on the desk where a leather-bound book had once Saturday. She'd always written in a journal, one she never let anyone read. Now it was missing. The only thing left was that torn page. "If anything happens, look to the..." I slipped it into my pocket, though I didn't know why. I spent hours walking through each room, touching the things that once felt like home: her reading glasses, a chipped teacup, the worn armchair where she'd read every night. It felt like saying goodbye for a second time. That night, Harold called again. His voice was low, cautious. "I wanted to warn you. Judge Cole requested access to the probate documents unusually fast. I've never seen a case move this quickly." "What does that mean?" "It means someone's pushing him." He hesitated. "Olivia, you're not imagining things. Your father has powerful connections. If you're planning to fight this, document everything. Every irregularity." After the call, I sat on the floor of her study, notebook in hand, and wrote those words, "Document everything." It felt like a promise. 2 weeks later, I drove past my father's office downtown. His face filled the digital billboard outside Charles Hartman Construction Building, "Tomorrow's Skyline." The slogan might as well have read, "Buying Today's Justice." At home, I pulled out the photograph from her funeral program. My grandmother, standing in front of her townhouse, arms crossed, a quiet smile of defiance on her face. Behind her, the brass key hung from a ribbon around her neck. The same one I now held. For the first time since the verdict, something inside me shifted, not grief, not rage, but clarity. The truth wasn't gone. It was buried, waiting. I ran my thumb over the engraving again and whispered to her memory, "You left me the map, didn't you? I just have to follow it." Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night. Somewhere within their glow, my father slept soundly, certain his secrets were safe. He had no idea his daughter was finally awake. The courthouse lobby smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I clutched the folder of case documents tighter, trying not to stare at the framed photographs of smiling judges along the marble wall. Their smiles looked different now, too polished, too rehearsed. I had returned to request certified copies of the probate decision, hoping that holding them in my own hands would make the nightmare feel real enough to fight. Instead, the place felt smaller, colder, as if the walls themselves were complicit. That's when I saw him again, the man from the hearing, Noah Grant. He stood near the records desk, speaking quietly with a clerk. He wasn't dressed like the other attorneys bustling past in expensive suits. His jacket was rumpled, his hair slightly out of place, and yet he carried himself with an ease that drew attention. When he noticed me, he gave a polite nod, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You're still fighting, huh?" he said as I approached. "I don't really have a choice," I replied. "They took everything." He leaned against the counter, his tone calm but curious. "Most people give up after the first ruling. I'm not most people." He studied me for a moment before introducing himself properly. "Noah Grant. I used to work for the federal prosecutor's office, white-collar division. These days I handle complicated messes, like bribed judges and stolen estates." His lips curved slightly. "Exactly like that." We walked to a nearby bench as clerks hurried past with stacks of files. He asked if I truly believed Judge Cole had been bribed. I nodded, my pulse quickening. "I can't prove it yet, but I know my father. He doesn't lose, not unless the game's rigged." Noah's gaze sharpened. "Judges don't risk their careers for pocket change. If Cole's involved, it's part of something bigger. Someone's protecting someone." The words sent a chill through me. Bigger. That meant my grandmother's case wasn't an isolated act of greed. It was part of a system, a web of favors and payoffs buried under the language of law. Noah stood. "If you're serious about this, I can help. I can't promise miracles, but I know where corruption hides." I hesitated. I didn't know this man, but everyone I did know had already betrayed me. "I'm in." We went downstairs to the records office, a fluorescent-lit basement full of humming machines and stale air. The clerk at the counter looked at us warily but handed over the requested documents after Noah flashed his old credentials. We sat at one of the long metal tables, spreading the files between us. Noah scanned quickly, his eyes darting across every line. "Something's off," he muttered. "These timestamps, see here. Your attorney filed supplemental exhibits at 9:32 a.m., but the docket shows they were marked rejected at 9:27. That's 5 minutes before they were even submitted. He turned the page. And look at this notation, medical evaluation incomplete. That means someone edited the file after it was submitted. I stared at the paper, the letters swimming before my eyes. Can they do that? No, not legally. But if Cole's clerk altered these records under his direction, it's evidence of judicial misconduct. He snapped a photo of the docket entry with his phone, lowering his voice. Everything leaves a trace, even corruption. You just have to know where to look. When we stepped outside, the afternoon sun glared off the courthouse windows, too bright, too clean. We crossed the street to a small cafe tucked between office buildings. It smelled of cinnamon and old coffee beans, a temporary refuge from the chaos. This isn't just about your inheritance anymore, Noah said, stirring sugar into his drink. If we're right, Cole's been manipulating rulings for years. Then why hasn't anyone stopped him? He looked at me, his expression weary. Because people who can stop him benefit from keeping him in power. I sank back into my seat. So what do? We find the paper trail, he said. Money always tells the truth. We trace every donation, every fund, every charitable contribution linked to your father's company and Cole's name. I wanted to believe him, but fear pressed against my ribs. And if we fail, then you'll still know you tried. His tone was steady, almost kind, and that's more than most people ever do. He gave me his card before leaving. Noah Grant, legal consultant, integrity above all. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every word, every possibility. I turned on my laptop and searched for Noah Grant. His name appeared in several old articles. Federal prosecutor resigns after exposing misconduct in defense contract case. He'd gone against his own department, lost his job, and quietly disappeared from public view. He wasn't a savior, but he understood what it meant to challenge power and pay the price. The next morning I met him again at his office. It was a small second-floor space above a bookstore filled with files, coffee mugs, and stacks of yellow legal pads. "Welcome to my empire," he joked. He opened a folder labeled Cole, Ethics, History. Inside were copies of rulings overturned for procedural irregularities. 3 cases stood out, each involving wealthy families or corporations tied to political donors. "Look at this one," he said, sliding a page toward me. Hollister versus Green. Cole dismissed a whistleblower claim after a last-minute donation to his judicial outreach fund. I read the line twice before realizing why it mattered. That fund was co-sponsored by Hartman Construction. Noah nodded grimly. "Your father's name appears on at least 2 similar cases. He's not just a client, he's part of the network." The realization hollowed me out. My father's reach went beyond business. He had built his empire not just with concrete and steel, but with influence, favors, and silence. Noah mentioned a name, Grace Holloway, a former court clerk who had worked under Cole. She left the judiciary 2 years ago. Said she couldn't stay quiet anymore. If we can find her, she might confirm everything. Why hasn't she come forward? She tried once, Noah said. The complaint vanished and she lost her job. I'll see if she's willing to talk again. We spent hours cross-referencing public financial disclosures with construction permits and court schedules. Each link made the picture clearer and uglier, donations timed perfectly, with verdicts, invoices coded as consulting, tax-deductible bribes disguised as civic goodwill. I leaned back exhausted. How do they sleep at night? They tell themselves it's legal, he said, and after a while they believe it. As the sun set, I drove home, the city's skyline rising like a monument to everything my father had corrupted. I thought of my grandmother, of how she'd tried to stand alone against men like him. Halfway down the freeway, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number again. "Stop digging before you lose more than money." I pulled over, staring at the screen, my pulse pounding. The message disappeared seconds later, deleted remotely. When I showed it to Noah the next day, he didn't look surprised. "They're watching you. That means we're close." "I'm not afraid of them," I lied. He smirked. "Good. Then we'll keep going." By evening, we'd mapped out a plan, gather Grace Holloway's testimony, verify the ledger's authenticity, if we found it, and secure backups of everything. As I packed up to leave, Noah handed me a flash drive. This holds copies of the documents we've collected. Hide it somewhere safe. They'll come for the originals. I slipped it into my purse, feeling its weight like a heartbeat. If they think I'm going to walk away, they don't know who they're dealing with. Noah's eyes met mine. Then let's make sure they find out. That night, thunder rolled over the city. I sat by the window watching lightning flash across the sky, thinking of my grandmother's words. Integrity is the inheritance they can't steal. Maybe she had known this fight would come. Maybe she had prepared me for it all along. I whispered to the dark, "You tried to silence her, Dad, but you taught me too well. I'm coming for the truth." And for the first time since her death, I felt something close to strength. The Denver courthouse loomed ahead like a monument to everything I no longer believed in. Morning fog clung to the stone steps, curling around my shoes as I waited for Noah. The ledger, the flash drive, the fragments of data we'd recovered, they all pointed to one truth: the law was never blind, it just looked away when paid to. Noah arrived with 2 coffees, and that steady composure I was beginning to envy. "You ready to step back into the lion's den?" he asked. I nodded, gripping my coat tighter. "Let's wake the ghosts." Inside the courthouse was eerily quiet, its marble floors echoing with each step. We made our way toward the archive wing where old court records were stored. The security guard at the desk barely looked up, waving us through after Noah flashed his consultant badge. The air inside was dry, filled with the faint smell of paper and dust. Rows of filing cabinets stretched endlessly, each drawer containing forgotten truths cases, ruling settlements. We moved carefully, cross-referencing case numbers from Noah's list. "This is where they bury corruption," he murmured, pulling open a drawer labeled Public Projects, 2019. The files inside were meticulously arranged, too neat, too intentional. I skimmed through dozens of project titles until one caught my eye: Public Parks Infrastructure, Phase 2. The same name from my grandmother's ledger. I froze. "Noah," I whispered. "Look." He stepped closer, scanning the header. "Approved by the Civic Development Fund, overseen by Judge Raymond Cole." My pulse quickened as I flipped the page. Payments routed through a consulting firm called Westmont Advisors, signed off by a P. Cole. Cole's brother-in-law, Noah, said grimly. This is how they laundered the bribe. I stared at the paper, realizing my father's name was listed further down as a construction partner. Charles Hartman, my father. Every cell in my body went cold. He paid the judge through his own company. He didn't even bother hiding it. They rarely do, Noah said, taking photos of each page. They count on fear and silence to keep them safe. The sound of footsteps echoed from down the hall. We both froze. A janitor pushing a mop cart turned the corner, whistling softly. I exhaled slowly, tension releasing from my shoulders. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. We left quietly, locking the drawer behind us. Outside, the fog had lifted into a thin drizzle. My hands trembled as we walked to Noah's car. That file, what happens if they realize we accessed it? They'll know, he said, starting the engine. But they can't erase what's already copied. As the city blurred past the window, I thought about my grandmother. She must have discovered this same connection, the payments, the fake contracts, and realized what her son had done. The truth must have broken her heart before it killed her. Noah drove us to a small cafe on the edge of the warehouse district. We sat in the corner booth, the rain streaking down the window like ink. You said you had a contact, I reminded him. He nodded. Grace Holloway, former senior clerk under Judge Cole. She knows more about how his office operated than anyone. Can we trust her? He hesitated. She walked away from a comfortable career to keep her conscience. That's usually a good sign. Before he could say more, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The text was short. You're getting close. Meet me tonight. Pier 14. Come alone. I showed Noah the message. Pier 14's abandoned, he said immediately. You're not going alone. That night, the city was washed in gray. Rain fell harder, drumming against the windshield as we pulled up near the old pier. The air smelled of salt and rust, the kind of place where secrets hid easily. A single figure stood under the flickering streetlight. Mid-40s, sharp features, soaked coat. Her eyes flicked between us as we approached. Grace Holloway, Noah asked. She nodded, lowering her hood. You shouldn't have come. They're watching everything. Then you know why we had to, I said. Her expression softened when she looked at me. You're Margaret Avery's granddaughter. I thought I recognized those eyes. The name hit me like a gust of wind. You knew her not personally, she said, but I knew her case. I was ordered to process her will when it first came through Cole's office. I saw what he did. Tell me, I whispered. Grace glanced around, lowering her voice. Your grandmother's original will came across my desk 3 days before it was officially filed. It was clean, no amendments, no inconsistencies. Then Cole called me into his chambers. He handed me a sealed envelope labeled Avery Estate, Internal Revision. I was told to replace the original document with the one inside. What was in the envelope? Noah asked. A scanned version of her will, she said, her voice trembling. Only it wasn't her handwriting. The signatures were copied. The digital watermark belonged to Cole's private account. I refused to do it. The next day, my workstation was wiped and I was reassigned. I resigned before they could fire me. Noah's jaw tightened. Do you still have proof? Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small USB drive. I kept this hidden. It has the forged document and memos from Cole's staff instructing me to destroy the original. I wasn't brave enough then. Maybe I can be now. The weight of what she handed me made my palms sweat. Inside this tiny piece of plastic was the truth my grandmother had died trying to protect. Before I could speak, headlights flared from the end of the street. A black SUV rolled slowly toward us. Grace's face went pale. They found us. Noah grabbed my arm. Back entrance now. We ran behind the pier as the SUV door opened. A bottle shattered near the wall behind us, the sharp scent of gasoline filling the air. I stumbled, heart pounding. We ducked through a side door, the sound of footsteps fading behind us. By the time we reached Noah's car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the USB twice. He caught it, sliding it into his jacket. You all right? I nodded, though the truth was, I'd never been less all right in my life. They tried to scare us. No, he said, voice steady. They tried to warn us. That's worse. Back at his office, we huddled around his laptop. Grace sat opposite us, her hair dripping onto her coat. When she plugged in the drive, a folder appeared with timestamps dating back 3 years. She opened the top file. There it was, Avery Estate, revision copy. The fake signature glared back at me like a wound. Grace pointed to another file. This one's a memo from Cole's account to your father's office. It references a Phase 2 funding confirmation. That's code for the kickback ledger you found. Noah scrolled through each file, taking screenshots, making backups. We'll need verification, he said. If we leak this now, they'll claim it's doctored. I can confirm the metadata, Grace said. The timestamps match the day I was ordered to delete the original. My voice was barely audible. He forged her will and killed her name to protect my father's empire. Grace looked at me, her expression full of guilt. I'm sorry, Olivia. I didn't stop it. But maybe now we can. We worked for hours copying files and saving encrypted versions on multiple drives. When the last progress bar hit 100%, Noah shut the laptop. If Cole sees this, he'll panic. And desperate men make mistakes. Grace rose to leave. I'll disappear for a while, she said. If you need me, use the number on that card. But be careful. Cole has friends everywhere. After she left, the silence felt heavy. Rain beat against the window like a warning. Noah leaned back in his chair. We have what they fear most, proof. I touched the USB drive, the metal warm from his hand. Then, let's make sure it sees daylight. He nodded, meeting my eyes. Tomorrow we start building the case. Outside, thunder cracked above the city, echoing against the courthouse walls. I stood at the window watching the storm, my reflection faint beside the lightning. For months, fear had owned me. Now, for the first time, I felt it breaking apart, replaced by something sharper. They wanted her erased, I said quietly. But she left breadcrumbs. She knew I'd find them. Noah joined me, his tone resolute. Then let's follow them to the end. The lights flickered, the rain softened, and the city below glowed faintly through the fog. A city full of secrets waiting to be dragged into the light. The night after Grace's revelation, I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment, the hum of a car engine, the slam of a door made my pulse race. I kept picturing the black SUV outside the pier, headlights cutting through rain like a warning. Somewhere out there, the people who'd silenced my grandmother were realizing I now had proof of what they'd done. When dawn finally broke, I made coffee I didn't drink and stared at the USB drive on the table. It was small enough to lose between two fingers, yet powerful enough to destroy reputations that had ruled this city for decades. I slipped it into the lining of my coat pocket, then grabbed my keys and drove toward Noah's office through the quiet Denver streets. He was already there, a half-empty cup of coffee beside his laptop, papers spread across his desk. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up. "You look like hell," he said without looking up. "I feel worse," I replied, closing the door behind me. He gestured to the monitor. "Grace's files are genuine. I ran forensic checks last night. The metadata lines up perfectly with Cole's court activity. So it's real." "Oh, it's very real," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And if we play it right, it's going to blow open something bigger than your grandmother's will." My stomach tightened. "Bigger how Cole didn't just alter your grandmother's estate," he said. "He's part of a ring of judges and attorneys who rerouted inheritances and trust funds to corporate donors in exchange for consulting fees. Your father's company is one of those donors." The words hit like a punch. "You're saying he's been bribing judges for years? Bribing, laundering, leveraging, pick your poison. They built an entire machine around it." I sank into the chair opposite him. "Then this isn't just corruption. It's organized," he nodded grimly. "And that means it's dangerous." Before I could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked the screen, frowning. "Grace." He put it on speaker. Her voice came through strained and urgent. "Noah, you need to listen. Someone broke into my apartment last night." My heart stopped. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. They didn't take anything. But they went through my desk, my computer. They're sending a message." "Go somewhere safe," Noah said. "Somewhere they can't find you." "I'm already on the move," she said. "There's one more thing, you should look into the Civic Development Fund. That's where Cole hides the larger transfers." I left details in the drive folder labeled C7. "Be careful, they're watching." The line went dead. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Noah rubbed his temple. "She's right. The Civic Fund is a shell organization. They use it for laundering payments disguised as public projects. Like the one in the ledger," I said softly. "Public parks infrastructure." He nodded. "If we can prove that connection, the entire bribery scheme unravels." We spent the morning combing through digital records, public filings, and court payments. Every few minutes, Noah's laptop chimed with another link between Cole's rulings and transfers into Hartman Construction's accounts. Then he froze, staring at the screen. "Here, a direct wire transfer, $200,000 from the Civic Fund to Hartman Construction, dated 2 weeks before your grandmother's will was contested." My throat tightened. He bought the verdict before the case even started. "It gets worse," Noah said, scrolling. "Cole approved zoning contracts for Hartman projects in exchange for his foundation receiving anonymous donations. This isn't a single bribe. It's an entire ecosystem of corruption." I stood pacing the room. "We have to expose this." "We will, but we need to do it the right way. If we go public now, they'll destroy the evidence faster than we can upload it." "Then what's the plan?" "Build an airtight case," he said. We'll prepare a judicial misconduct motion, supported by Grace's files, the civic fund records, and that ledger. Once filed, the court has to investigate. I hesitated, and my father, his eyes met mine. He'll go down with them. The thought should have satisfied me. Instead, it made my chest ache. That afternoon, I returned to my apartment and found the door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The lights were off, but I could smell cigarette smoke, sharp and unfamiliar. My breath caught. I flicked the switch. Papers were scattered across the floor. Drawers open. My grandmother's photograph lay face down near the couch. They'd been here. I ran to the kitchen where I'd hidden the spare flash drive behind the sugar canister. Gone. My phone rang. Unknown number. A man's voice, calm, deliberate. "Miss Hartman, you're meddling in matters far above your understanding. Walk away before you end up regretting your curiosity." I swallowed hard. "Who is this?" he chuckled softly. "Let's just say I'm someone who appreciates discretion." The line went dead. I called Noah immediately. They broke into my place, took one of the drives. "Stay put," he said quickly. "Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 10. True to his word, he arrived fast, scanning the room with sharp eyes. "They were looking for the files," he muttered. "They know what Grace gave us." He crouched near the bookshelf, inspecting a small device wedged behind a photo frame. "A listening bug," he said. "Old model, but effective." My stomach dropped. They were listening to me, probably since the hearing. "But don't panic. We'll use it to our advantage." He pulled out the device, pocketing it. "Let them think they're winning. They'll get sloppy." After he left, I sat on the couch shaking. The walls felt smaller, the air heavier. For the first time, I realized what this fight was costing me: safety, privacy, maybe even my career. But then I looked at my grandmother's photograph on the floor. Her calm eyes stared back as if reminding me why I'd started. By evening, Noah called with news. I traced one of the civic fund accounts to an offshore bank. Guess who authorized the transfer? My pulse quickened. "Who? Your father?" "His signature's on the authorization letter." I closed my eyes. So he really did it. All of it. Noah's voice softened. "You can still walk away, Olivia. No one would blame you." I let out a bitter laugh. If I walk away, he wins again. My grandmother loses again. And this city keeps pretending justice isn't for sale. He paused, then said quietly, "Then we finish this." Later that night, we met in his office again. The city lights shimmered through the window as rain began to fall. Noah spread the documents across the desk like a battlefield map. "This," he said, pointing to the ledger, "links the money trail. Grace's USB confirms tampering. The civic fund transfers prove motive. We're close." I stared at the pages, my voice barely a whisper. "If we file that motion, my father's career is over." "Your grandmother's life already was," Noah said. The silence that followed was heavy but honest. Finally, I said, "Then we file it." As he prepared the paperwork, I stood at the window watching the rain streak down the glass. For months, grief had been my cage. Now it was becoming my weapon. When he finished, he handed me the document to sign. "You understand what this means, right? Once this hits the court, there's no going back." "I don't want to go back," I said, signing my name. He looked at me with something close to admiration. "You really are her granddaughter." The words settled in my chest like warmth against the storm. Outside, lightning flared across the skyline, illuminating the courthouse in the distance. I thought of my father inside his glass office tower, untouchable, smug, certain the world still revolved around him. He had no idea that the storm was coming for him next. The rain hadn't stopped since the night we filed the motion. It tapped against my apartment window like impatient fingers, steady and relentless, echoing the rhythm of my thoughts. Sleep had become a luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's signature on that transfer letter, Judge Cole's smirk from the bench, my grandmother's calm eyes in her photograph. Lies and truth overlapped until I couldn't separate them anymore. When my phone buzzed, I almost ignored it. Then I saw Noah's name. I found something he said without preamble. "Meet me at your grandmother's townhouse. Bring the brass key. The brass key. I hadn't touched it in weeks, afraid of what it might unlock. I drove through sheets of rain to Tacoma Avenue, where her house sat quiet beneath a curtain of mist. The gate creaked when I pushed it open, and for a moment, the air smelled like wet lavender, the scent she used to spray on her curtains every spring. Noah was waiting on the porch, rain dripping from his coat. I think the answers we need are in there, he said, nodding toward the house. I thought the police sealed everything. They did, he replied, lifting a small crowbar from his bag. But the truth doesn't wait for permission. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memory. The living room looked frozen in time, her reading glasses still on the coffee table, a teacup ring marking the wooden surface. Every object felt sacred. We moved room to room, careful not to disturb anything. Then Noah stopped in the study, eyes fixed on the old oak chest in the corner. That's it, he said softly. I knelt beside it, tracing the carved roses along the lid. The same roses from my grandmother's stationery. My fingers found the tiny lock beneath the handle. I pulled out the brass key and slipped it in. The lock turned with a quiet click that echoed through the room like a secret exhale. Inside were stacks of old notebooks neatly tied with ribbon and several envelopes marked with dates. One bundle was labeled Blue Harbor. Another said Phase 2. I felt the air leave my lungs. Noah crouched beside me, opening one of the notebooks carefully, his brows furrowed as he flipped through the pages. These aren't diaries, he murmured. They're log surveillance reports, meeting notes, even court references. Look at this. I leaned closer. In her precise handwriting, my grandmother had listed payments, case numbers, and initials. Each line detailed how funds moved through the Civic Development Fund and into private accounts. She documented everything, I whispered. Every bribe, every transaction, every fake ruling, Noah said. She built her own archive. I pulled another envelope from the bottom of the chest. Inside were black and white photographs, two men shaking hands outside a courthouse. My father and Judge Cole. On the back, in my grandmother's hand, was written proof of coordination, March 2018. My hands shook. She knew they were working together. Noah's eyes hardened, and she was preparing to expose them. We worked for hours, photographing each page, each signature, each timestamp. The deeper we went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a single case. It was a network of corruption spanning years. Judges, attorneys, city officials, all trading verdicts for money and influence. She wasn't just protecting her estate, I said quietly. She was protecting justice itself. Noah nodded, voice low, and they silenced her for it. The realization settled like ice in my stomach. My father hadn't just betrayed me. He'd helped destroy the only person who ever stood up to him. We packed the evidence into waterproof bags and prepared to leave. But when Noah opened the front door, headlights flared outside. A car idled across the street, its engine rumbling. Get down, he whispered, pulling me away from the window. We crouched behind the chest as footsteps approached the porch. Someone tried the door handle. Then a man's voice called out, muffled by the rain. Miss Hartman, you're making a mistake. Your grandmother's secrets should stay buried. My blood ran cold. It was Mark Delaney, my father's attorney. Noah motioned for silence. After a few tense seconds, the footsteps retreated. Tires splashed through puddles and the car disappeared into the dark. He's desperate, Noah said, standing slowly. That means we're close. We locked the chest again and carried the copies to the car. The rain followed us all the way back to the city. At Noah's office, we spread everything across the desk. The ledger, the photos, the notebooks. Together they formed a web of corruption so detailed it could topple half of Denver's legal elite. This is enough for an ethics investigation, Noah said. Maybe even criminal charges. But we need corroboration, I said. Someone inside the system who can verify these records. He thought for a moment, then nodded. Grace. She worked under Cole. She can identify his handwriting, the timestamps, the fake dockets. We called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice shaky. I've been waiting for your call. Noah told her what we'd found. There was a long silence, then Grace said, "I can confirm those documents. I saw some of those entries myself before Cole ordered me to delete them. But you have to be careful. If Cole knows you have physical evidence, he'll escalate." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means he'll use every tool at his disposal, media threats, even the law itself. He'll make you the criminal." When the call ended, the room felt smaller, tighter. I could hear my grandmother's words in my head: power doesn't fear truth, it fears exposure. Noah started scanning each page into a secure digital vault. "We'll build 2 backup drives," he said. "One stays with me, one with you." As I watched him work, exhaustion gave way to something steadier: resolve. For months I'd been surviving on anger and fear, but now I had something real. Proof. A legacy worth defending. By midnight we had cataloged everything. Noah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You realize what happens when we go public with this," he said. "They'll drag your name through the mud. Your family's influence will crumble. You might lose your career." "I already lost my family," I said quietly. "This is all that's left." He gave me a long look, then nodded. "Then we fight." Before leaving, I walked to the window. Rain still fell softer now, reflecting the city lights like scattered glass. I could see my reflection, faintly tired eyes, trembling hands, but beneath it all, something fierce. I turned to Noah. They thought she was alone. They thought I'd be afraid. And now he asked. Now I understand why she kept fighting. That night I drove home with the second backup drive in my bag. The streets were nearly empty except for the faint glow of streetlights cutting through fog. When I parked outside my building, I checked the rearview mirror, nothing but rain. Upstairs, I placed the drive inside the hollow of an old book on my shelf, then locked my door twice. Before turning off the lights, I pulled out one of my grandmother's notebooks from the chest copies. On the last page, she'd written a single line: "If truth must outlive me, let it live through you." I closed the book, my throat tight. She hadn't written those words for herself. She'd written them for me. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. Somewhere, my father and Judge Cole were still sleeping peacefully, unaware that the ground beneath them was beginning to crack. I sat at my desk until dawn, the evidence spread before me like a map of everything they'd stolen. And as the first light of morning touched the city, I made a silent promise to her, to myself, and to every person who'd ever been silenced by power. I would finish what she started, no matter what it cost. The night air in Denver felt heavier than usual, dense with the kind of tension that clings to your skin. I sat in my car outside Noah's office, staring at the streetlights reflecting off rain-slick pavement. Every shadow looked like someone watching. Every silence felt like a warning. When my phone vibrated, I jumped. The caller ID read unknown. I answered cautiously. "Hello," a sharp breath then, Grace's voice trembling. "Olivia, they found me." "Where are you?" "I don't know. I left my apartment. 2 men were parked outside all night. I think they've been following me since the day we met." My grip tightened on the phone. "Get somewhere public. Don't go home. I'm already moving. But there's something I didn't tell you before." Her voice broke for a moment. "Cole wasn't just taking bribes for your father. He's been covering up other cases, inheritances, fraud, embezzlement. People who crossed him ended up ruined or gone." The line crackled, her words slicing through static. "Meet me tonight. The diner on 6th and Willow. Bring Noah. I'll bring proof." Before I could respond, the call dropped. Noah arrived 10 minutes later, still in his work clothes, dark circles under his eyes. "Grace, she's running. She says she has more evidence," he exhaled slowly. "Then we can't wait. If she's scared, it means she's ready to talk, but it also means someone's closing in." The diner was half empty when we arrived. Chrome counters humming, fluorescent lights, the smell of burnt coffee. Grace sat in a corner booth, her coat soaked, her hands trembling around a cup. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, when we slid into the booth across from her. "You called us," Noah said. "I thought it would be safer in public," she murmured. "But safe doesn't exist anymore." Her eyes darted toward the window where a car idled in the rain. "What do you have?" I asked. Grace pulled a thick envelope from her bag and pushed it across the table. "Emails between Cole and your father's office. They used code names Phase 2, Blue Haven, Civic Projects." I decoded them with old internal memos. It's all their proof of payments instructions to alter rulings, even communication about other families who lost everything. Noah opened the envelope, his brow tightening as he skimmed the pages. "Jesus," he muttered. "These are time-stamped during active cases." He wasn't even subtle. "He didn't have to be," Grace said bitterly. "He thought no one would ever challenge him." A waitress passed by, refilling our coffees, oblivious to the weight of what sat between us. "Grace," I said softly, "why are you doing this? You could walk away." She looked down at her hands. "Because I didn't stop him when I should have. I let fear decide for me. And people got hurt because of it." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "One of them was your grandmother. I saw her file being transferred the night before it went to court. Cole told me not to ask questions about the Hartman matter. I knew what that meant." The words hit like glass splintering in my chest. Noah leaned in. "Grace, we'll protect you. But we need a statement, something official." "I'll write one," she said. "But you need to act fast. Someone in the courthouse is feeding Cole updates. He knows about the motion you filed." I froze. How she hesitated. He still has friends there. "I overheard his clerk last year say Cole could make any case disappear with one phone call. If he feels cornered, he'll burn everything to save himself." Before we could respond, the door opened. A man in a dark coat entered, pausing just long enough for our eyes to meet. His expression was neutral, too neutral. Noah whispered, "We're leaving." We slipped out through the back exit into the rain-soaked alley. The night was cold and sharp. Grace clutched the envelope to her chest, glancing behind us. "That's one of them," she said. "He's been following me since last week." Noah guided us toward his car parked 2 blocks away. We moved fast, water splashing under our feet, every sound amplified. When we reached the car, I turned around. The man was gone. Back at Noah's office, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly as we spread Grace's documents across the desk. The evidence was damning. There were scanned invoices labeled consultation services, corresponding to exact court dates and rulings. Payments disguised as donations from my father's subsidiaries. Emails with coded language, delivering Phase 2 outcome. Ensure approval by end of quarter. Noah's voice was low, almost reverent. "We're staring at a blueprint for judicial corruption." Grace sat silently staring at the window. "It's worse than you think," she said finally. "Cole wasn't acting alone. There are at least 3 judges tied to the same accounts." I looked up sharply. "Names?" She hesitated, then nodded. "One of them is already on the appeals court." The room fell silent. Noah broke it first. "If this is true, we'll need to go to the ethics committee and bypass Cole's influence entirely." "They'll never believe me," Grace said. "Cole made sure every complaint I filed was erased before it hit the docket." I met her eyes. "Then we'll give them something they can't erase." Noah began photographing each page, storing digital copies on an encrypted drive. The whir of the scanner filled the silence. I stood beside Grace, watching the reflection of her face in the rain-streaked window. She looked like someone who'd already accepted what she was risking. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," I said, "we make them afraid." The words felt strange in my mouth, cold, deliberate, but true. Noah's printer beeped. "We'll draft a preliminary brief tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we file it. And once it's public, they can't bury it." Grace nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. "Just promise me one thing. If they come after me again, don't stop, no matter what happens." Before I could answer, the lights flickered, then went out. For a split second, the room was swallowed by darkness. Then Noah's phone flashlight cut through the black. "Backup generators out," he muttered. Through the window, headlights flared. A car was parked across the street, no plates visible, engine running. "Grace," I said, heart pounding, "stay down." We crawled to the floor behind the desk. Noah peeked through the blinds. "They're watching." just sitting there. The minutes stretched the tension so thick it hurt to breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car pulled away. When the lights flickered back on Grace was pale, trembling. "He won't stop," she whispered. "He's too powerful." Noah looked at her, calm but firm. Power only matters until people stop pretending it's invincible. She didn't answer. She just reached into her bag, pulling out a small flash drive. "This is a backup of everything. If anything happens to me, use it. Don't hesitate." She pressed it into my hand before leaving. I could feel her fear through her touch, cold, real, human. When the door closed, Noah sank into his chair. "They're scared. That means we're winning." I stared at the flash drive, its metallic surface catching the light. Winning didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. "We have enough to destroy them," I said. "But what if they destroy us first?" He smiled faintly. "Then we go down, making noise." Outside, thunder rolled across the city, shaking the windows. I turned to the stack of papers on the desk, each page a fragment of truth my grandmother had started collecting years ago. She had faced them alone. I wasn't alone anymore. I thought of her words, "Power doesn't fear truth, it fears exposure." "Then let's expose them," I whispered. Noah met my eyes and nodded. "Tomorrow everything changes." That night, as I drove home, rain blurred the road into streaks of silver and black. My reflection in the windshield looked like someone I didn't recognize, harder, older, resolute. When my phone buzzed again, I almost ignored it. The message was short, the same unknown number as before. "You think you're saving justice, Miss Hartman. You're digging your grandmother's grave twice." The words glowed on the screen as the rain hammered against the car. For a long time, I didn't move. Then I deleted the message, started the engine, and whispered into the storm, "No. I'm digging yours." The morning after Grace's warning felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. My apartment was filled with the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the echo of words I couldn't unhear. "You're digging your grandmother's grave twice." I tried to tell myself it was just intimidation, the kind of threat people like my father used to keep others obedient. But fear had a way of sneaking into the smallest cracks. By 9 a.m., Noah was knocking at my door. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "We've got a problem," he said, stepping inside. "Cole's lawyers filed an emergency injunction. They're trying to seal all proceedings related to your grandmother's estate." My stomach dropped. "Can they do that?" "Not without good reason," he said, setting his briefcase on the counter. "But they're claiming the documents involve classified material from old government contracts. It's a stall tactic, but an effective one." "Classified material," I laughed bitterly. My grandmother ran a literacy foundation, not the CIA. Noah's expression didn't change. "They're desperate. They'll use anything to stop this from going public." He opened the folder he was carrying and handed me a printed letter. It was embossed with the Hartman Construction logo. My father's signature glared from the bottom. "What is this?" "It's an offer," Noah said quietly. $250,000 for you to withdraw the judicial misconduct motion. In exchange, all assets will be released immediately in your favor, minus the oak chest and its contents. I read it twice. My hands started to shake. "He's trying to buy me off." Noah nodded. "And he's smart enough to make it look generous." I sank into a chair. The number stared back at me, zero after zero. That much money could wipe out my student loans, my debts, maybe even give me a chance to start over somewhere far away from all this. "I don't understand," I said softly. "He already won once. Why offer this now?" "Because you have something he wants more than money," Noah said. "Proof." We sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the letter pressed down like a stone. "I could end this," I murmured finally. "No more threats, no more lawyers, no more running." "And live knowing you let him bury her twice?" Noah asked. His tone wasn't harsh, but the words stung. I stared at the paper again, the ink smudging beneath my thumb. "You think I'm weak if I take it. I think you're human if you're tempted," he said. "But you're your grandmother's granddaughter if you don't." His words lingered long after he left. I folded the letter, then unfolded it again, as if doing so would make the decision easier. I could almost hear my father's voice, calm, reasonable, promising peace. "This isn't personal, Liv. It's just business." That night, I drove to the river and sat in my car watching the water twist under the bridge lights. My grandmother's voice came back to me from years ago. Integrity isn't about what's easy. It's about what costs you something. I pulled out a lighter from the glove box. My hands didn't shake this time. The flame touched the corner of the paper, and the offer curled, blackened, and disappeared into ash. The smell of burnt ink filled the air, sharp and final. When I called Noah afterward, he didn't sound surprised. "I figured you'd pick fire over silence." "I learned from the best," I said. He chuckled softly. "Then get some sleep. Tomorrow they'll come back swinging." He was right. The next morning I woke to 3 voicemails. The first was from my employer. "Olivia, we need to talk about your absences," my supervisor said stiffly. "You're suspended pending review." The second was from an unknown number. "You should have taken the deal." The third was my mother. "Liv, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father is furious. He says you're making enemies who won't stop. He didn't mean for it to go this far. Just walk away before you get hurt." I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the phone. The woman who'd spent my childhood pretending not to see my father's cruelty now wanted me to help him hide it. By noon, Noah called again. "They've filed a defamation notice against Grace," he said. "She's officially under investigation for false testimony. They're trying to discredit her before she can testify." My jaw clenched. "They won't get away with this," he sighed. "They already have for years. But not this time. We'll fight it. How we push forward. I'm drafting an appeal to the Judicial Ethics Board. And we'll file a complaint with the State Bar against Delaney for conflict of interest." I could hear typing in the background, the steady rhythm of Noah's resolve. "Olivia," he said after a moment, his voice softening, "this is going to get ugly. They'll smear you, threaten you, maybe worse." "You still want to do this?" "I didn't come this far to quit," I said. And neither did she. Later that day, we met in his office. The walls were lined with case files and a corkboard covered in photographs, diagrams, and red strings connecting names: Cole Delaney, my father's shell companies, the Civic Development Fund. The scope of it was dizzying. Grace's flash drive contained an additional folder, Noah said, gesturing toward his computer. "Inside, there's a memo titled Blue Haven Asset Protection. It details how Cole and your father funneled funds through federal infrastructure grants. It's proof of conspiracy." "Then that's what we use." "We will," he said. "But we need to time it right. First, we'll secure corroboration. Then we release it to the ethics board and the press simultaneously. If one gets silenced, the other survives." I stared at the screen. "They'll come for us." "They already are," he said. "But they're losing control. That makes them dangerous." The word dangerous lingered in the air like smoke. That night, I went to see my mother. Her house smelled of lilies and lemon cleaner, as sterile as her voice when she opened the door. "Olivia," she said, frowning. "What are you doing here?" "I came to ask you something," I said. "Did you know about the bribes?" She froze. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." "You signed the foundation's tax forms. You saw the donations." Her hand trembled as she reached for her glass of wine. "I didn't ask questions. Your father said it was better that way." I felt something in me fracture. Better for who? She didn't answer. "You could have stopped this," I said quietly. "You could have protected her." Her eyes glistened with tears, but her voice stayed cold. "You don't understand the things your father can do." "I understand perfectly," I said. "That's why I'm not afraid anymore." When I left, she didn't follow me to the door. The next morning, Noah called with a grim tone. Grace's apartment was broken into again. "She's safe, but she's leaving town until the hearing. We'll have to handle the filings ourselves." "Then we do it," I said. We met at dawn in the courthouse parking lot. The air was sharp, the city still half asleep. Noah carried the box of documents while I held the folder with the official complaint. Each step toward the clerk's office felt like walking into a storm, but I didn't hesitate. When the clerk stamped the papers, the sound echoed louder than it should have. "That's it," Noah said quietly. "There's no going back now." "Good," I said. "I'm done looking back." Outside, the sky was streaked with the first light of morning. My phone buzzed another unknown number. I didn't answer this time. I just turned it off and slipped it into my bag. Noah smiled faintly. "You're learning from the best," I said again. We walked down the courthouse steps together as the city began to stir awake. For the first time in months, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not victory, but clarity. Justice had a price, and I was finally willing to pay it. The storm rolled over the city before dawn thunder shaking the windows of my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the flickering candlelight when the power cut out again. Outside, the wind howled like a warning. Ever since we filed the complaint, I'd been waiting for the retaliation to come. Now I could feel it. My phone buzzed. "Noah." "Don't panic," he said as soon as I answered. But my office was broken into. I froze. They trashed the place. Computers, hard drives, everything. The safe's empty. "The file's gone," he said grimly. "But I backed up copies to the encrypted server. We're not completely wiped." I grabbed my coat and keys. "I'm coming." By the time I arrived, police lights painted the wet pavement blue and red. Noah stood near the entrance, soaked and furious, talking to an officer who looked too young to understand what was really happening. Inside his office looked like a war zone. Drawers, overturned monitors, smashed paper, scattered like confetti. "This wasn't random," Noah said when I joined him. "They were looking for something specific. The chest files, probably. Or the civic fund transfers." I walked to the broken safe in the corner. It was torn open, the metal edges bent like tinfoil. "They knew exactly where to look," I said softly. "Someone tipped them off." Noah nodded. "Grace warned us Cole still has allies in the courthouse. One of them must have leaked our filing." Before I could reply, his phone rang again. He answered, but his expression shifted from alert to alarm. "Grace," his voice rose. "Slow down. What do you mean they found you?" I leaned closer, catching fragments. "Two men outside. Black SUV. Following me." Then static. The line went dead. Noah cursed under his breath. "She's gone. Gone how she said they were following her." Then nothing. For a moment the world tilted. Grace had risked everything to help us. Now she was in danger because of me. "We have to find her," I said. "We will," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But first we make sure her evidence isn't lost." He started his laptop, running recovery software on one of the backup drives. The screen flickered, lines of code scrolling like lifelines. "I can restore fragments," he muttered. "Maybe not everything, but enough." The power flickered again. I stood near the window watching rain streak across the glass. "Do you think they'll stop?" Noah didn't look up. "No, not until one of us does." Hours later, the computer beeped a recovered folder. He clicked it open. Inside were partial scans of the ledger, timestamped emails, and one file labeled Phase 2 Avery Doc. He opened it. The document contained an email chain between Judge Cole and my father. The subject line, Avery Estate Adjustment. My throat went dry as I read. Proceed as discussed. Ensure approval prior to finalization. Transfer complete upon confirmation. The date 2 days before my grandmother's death. They finalized everything before she even died, I whispered. Noah looked grim. This proves coordination. It's premeditation. If we can authenticate it, it's enough for the ethics committee to launch a full investigation. I sank into the chair, shaking. They killed her will before they killed her name. He reached across the table, placing a steady hand on mine. Then let's make sure she's the one who ends this. When dawn broke, the storm had eased into a misty drizzle. The city looked washed out and weary. I drove to the courthouse, following Noah's instructions to meet Harold Stone, my grandmother's former attorney. He had agreed to see us after hearing about the missing files. His cabin sat near a lake an hour outside the city, a quiet retreat that smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. He opened the door before I could knock, an old man with sharp eyes and a cautious tone. "I heard about the break-in," he said. "Come in before anyone sees you." Inside, his fireplace crackled softly. Legal books lined the walls, a lifetime of rules and secrets. Noah joined us soon after, carrying his laptop. "Harold," I said, "you mentioned before that my grandmother gave you a copy of her original will." He nodded, retrieving a weathered folder from his cabinet. "Certified and notarized," he said. "I kept it hidden because I suspected Judge Cole would try to alter it. I didn't expect him to succeed." Noah scanned the document, comparing it to the fraudulent one Cole had approved. Different signatures, different witnesses. "This is the real one." Harold's gaze softened when he looked at me. "She trusted you'd find the truth someday. She told me that right before she got sick." "She knew," I murmured. "She knew he'd come after her, even after the divorce." Harold sighed. "Margaret wasn't just fighting for money. She was trying to protect the foundation's funds from being funneled into your father's projects. She discovered he was using nonprofit accounts as collateral for private investments." I felt my stomach twist. "He used her charity to fund his business, among other things," Harold said. "And when she threatened to go public, Cole convinced her it would destroy the family name." A week later, her cancer worsened, and everything she owned was suddenly under probate review. The pieces clicked together like teeth of a lock. "He blackmailed her," I said. "And when she wouldn't bend, he rewrote her will." Noah leaned forward. "Harold, will you testify to that?" The old man hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm retired. I've spent 40 years watching men like your father win. But yes, I will." For the first time in days, hope flickered again. As we packed the files, Noah's phone buzzed. "A text, they're on to you. Leave now." He showed it to me. "No sender ID." Harold frowned. "You'd better take the back road. People have been asking questions about you two." Outside, fog hugged the trees, turning the world ghostly. As Noah drove, I watched raindrops slide down the windshield, each one catching fragments of reflected light. "What if Grace is gone for good?" I asked quietly. "She's not," he said. "They want to scare her, not kill her." "Not yet." Yet he looked at me, his voice low. "Olivia, this isn't just about money anymore. If the committee opens a case, these men lose everything: careers, reputations, control. They won't let that happen easily." I leaned back, staring at the gray blur of trees. Then they picked the wrong family to threaten. We reached the city just as the storm began again, rain hitting harder this time. At Noah's office, the lights were still out from the break-in, but his backup generator hummed faintly. He set the recovered documents on his desk, arranging them in neat stacks. "This is everything we have left," he said. "The ledger Harold's notarized, will the Phase 2 email, and our affidavits. It's enough to file for judicial recusal. And Cole," he smiled faintly. "If we play this right, he'll recuse himself before he's removed." We worked through the night, drafting statements, scanning documents, cross-referencing timelines. My hands shook from exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me moving. Every word felt like a strike against the people who thought they were untouchable. At one point, Noah looked up from the desk. "You're different now." I blinked at him. "Different how?" "You're not afraid anymore," he said simply. I thought about it, then nodded. "Because fear only works when you're alone. She's still with me." He smiled, understanding. "Then let's finish what she started." By the time the sun rose, the storm had passed. The sky was pale gold, the streets wet and shining. We printed the final motion, clipped it neatly into a file, and placed it in my bag. Noah locked the office door behind us. Next, stopped the courthouse. As we stepped into the quiet morning, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Everything we'd lost, Grace's safety, the files, even our peace, had led to this moment. "They wanted to bury her legacy," I said, tightening my grip on the folder. "But she buried the truth right under their feet." Noah looked at me with something close to pride. Then let's dig it up. We walked toward the car side by side as sunlight finally broke through the clouds. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time I knew we were going to win. The next morning I woke before sunrise, my mind already racing. The sky outside my window was streaked with orange and gray, the kind of fragile light that made everything look temporary. Buildings, promises, even fear. On the table beside me lay the file we'd spent all night assembling: the ledger, the notarized will, the forged documents, and the Phase 2 email. The evidence my grandmother had died protecting. By the time I reached Noah's office, he was already there. Sleeves rolled up, tie loose, his desk, a battlefield of papers. Harold's affidavit came in overnight, he said, handing me a signed copy. He verified every discrepancy in Cole's rulings and confirmed that the will filed with the court wasn't the one Margaret signed. Good, I said, forcing calm into my voice. Then it's time. He glanced at the clock. We file this and there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. I met his eyes. I'm done living in bottles. We drove to the courthouse in silence. The city was still waking, storefronts opening, coffee carts steaming, but the courthouse already buzzed with motion. Lawyers, clerks, and reporters milled about the marble steps like bees sensing a storm. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and old paper. We walked straight to the clerk's counter. The woman behind the glass, a middle-aged clerk with sharp eyes and kind hands, took the file without a word. When she saw the title on the cover, her expression shifted slightly. Judicial recusal and misconduct motion, she read aloud. Noah nodded. Filed under Avery v. Hartman. Urgent. Her gaze flicked to me, recognition dawning. You're Olivia Hartman? Yes. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. There's talk around here, Miss Hartman. People are saying Judge Cole's been too close to certain cases. You're not the only one filing complaints lately. I blinked. I'm not. She shook her head. You didn't hear it from me. We thanked her and left. Outside the courtroom corridor, I felt my pulse slow just slightly. The tide was turning. People were finally whispering his name. But before I could breathe in relief, I saw him. My father stood at the far end of the hall, perfectly composed in his tailored suit, Mark Delaney at his side. He smiled as if greeting an old friend. Olivia, he said, voice smooth as silk. You've made quite the spectacle. I forced myself to hold his gaze. You taught me well, he chuckled softly. This isn't a game you can win. Do you have any idea what you're risking? Your career, your reputation, your safety? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You're worried. That means I'm doing something right. His smile faltered for the briefest second, then returned tighter. You're still my daughter, he said. Take the settlement. Walk away while there's still a door open. I'd rather build my own, he sighed, glancing toward Delaney. Your stubbornness will ruin you. I turned toward Noah. It's already ruined him. We walked past them, the echo of my father's polished shoes following us, until the hallway curved out of sight. By noon, the motion was officially filed. Noah and I returned to his office, where the old coffee machine sputtered like it too was exhausted by the fight. He handed me a mug and sat down. They'll try to discredit everything he said. Expect a counter motion by tonight. They can file whatever they want. We have the truth, he smiled faintly. I hope that's still enough. As if summoned by fate, his phone buzzed with an email notification. He opened it, scanning quickly. His expression hardened. Here it is. Cole's attorneys filed an emergency motion to seal all records citing national security. I blinked. National security. That's absurd. Not if they argue your grandmother's charity was tied to federal education grants. They'll claim the documents contain classified information. So they'll bury the evidence under patriotism, I said bitterly. Exactly. We spent the rest of the day strategizing, drafting responses, listing every angle they could take. It was late afternoon when Noah's phone rang again. Grace. She sounded frantic. I found something, Cole's old case logs. There's a memo labeled Operation Blue Haven. It connects your father's company to 3 other judges. I pressed the phone closer to my ear. Blue Haven. That's the same code name from my grandmother's notes. Grace's voice dropped. He's not just one corrupt judge, Olivia. He's part of an entire circuit. Before we could ask more, she hung up, whispering something about being followed again. Noah rubbed his forehead. We need to move faster. If Blue Haven surfaces, it could bring federal oversight into this. Then let's bring it first, I said, before they rewrite history again. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city hummed outside my window, neon lights reflecting off the glass. I sat at my desk writing 2 letters by hand, one to the ethics committee summarizing the case, the other to the press outlining what we'd uncovered in case I didn't make it to the hearing. I sealed both in envelopes and tucked them inside my grandmother's oak chest, locking it with the brass key. The act felt ceremonial, almost sacred. When I finally closed my eyes, my dreams were filled with her voice. If truth must outlive me, let it live through you. The next morning, Noah called before dawn. They leaked to the media, he said. Cole's office released a statement claiming the allegations are fabricated, the work of a disgruntled heir. I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes when anger runs out. Disgruntled heir, that's new. They're spinning the narrative, he said. We need to take it back. How? By going public. Carefully. He reached out to a journalist he trusted, Leah Ortega, known for exposing city corruption. That afternoon, we met her at a small cafe tucked between 2 bookstores. She looked younger than I expected, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. Show me what you've got, she said, sliding her recorder onto the table. Noah opened his briefcase and laid out the evidence like a story told in paper and inked: the ledger, the will, the emails, the notarized affidavit. Leah read in silence, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. When she finished, she looked up. You're accusing one of the city's most respected judges and one of its most powerful businessmen of colluding to rig estate cases for profit. Yes, I said simply. She leaned back, crossing her arms. Do you have corroboration beyond these documents? Witness testimony, Noah said. Grace Holloway, former court clerk. And Harold Stone, retired attorney. Leah nodded slowly. This could explode, but if I publish before it's verified, they'll crush me in court. I'll need to run it through our legal team. How long? I asked. 48 hours, 2 days. It felt like forever. That night, we returned to the office and finalized our supplemental brief for the committee. The city lights burned outside, a restless sea of gold and glass. As we worked, I noticed Noah watching me. You realize, he said quietly, that once this goes public, you'll never have a normal life again. I smiled faintly. Normal died the day they forged her will. He nodded, satisfied. Then, let's make sure it meant something. We printed the final version and sealed it. The folder was thick, heavy, almost alive. On the cover, in bold black letters, the title read, Petition for Judicial Recusal and Misconduct Investigation, Judge Raymond Cole. When we dropped it into the Ethics Committee's overnight box, the sound it made was small but final. Outside, dawn was breaking again, streaks of pink and gold spilling over the courthouse. I stood on the steps, breathing in the cold air, watching the sun catch on the marble columns. This is it, Noah said beside me. The point of no return. I turned to him. Then let's not look back. He smiled, just barely. You sound like her. I hope I do. We stood there for a long time, watching the city wake up beneath the rising Sunday. Somewhere out there, my father was already plotting his next move, and Judge Cole was preparing his defense. But for the first time since this began, I didn't feel small. For the first time, I felt like we had finally stepped into their light and brought the truth with us. The courthouse buzzed like a beehive long before the doors opened. Reporters crowded the marble steps, microphones angled toward every new arrival. Cameras flashed against the pale morning light, capturing faces that pretended calm but carried the tremor of expectation. I walked through the chaos chin high, the weight of my grandmother's locket warm against my skin. Beside me, Noah carried the case file, his expression unreadable, the picture of composure before war. Remember, he murmured. As we entered, they'll try to make you emotional. Stay factual. Stay calm. "I've been calm for too long," I said quietly. Inside, the courtroom was already full. I could feel the shift in energy as we took our seats at the petitioner's table. My father sat at the opposite end, perfectly groomed, his lawyer, Mark Delaney, whispering into his ear. Judge Cole sat one row behind them, pale but defiant, pretending to be merely an observer. And at the bench sat Judge Mara Sandoval, the woman who would decide whether truth could survive corruption. Her gavel struck once. Court is now in session. We're here to review the motion for recusal and alleged judicial misconduct regarding Judge Raymond Cole in the matter of the Avery estate. Delaney rose first, his tone confident and rehearsed. "Your Honor, this case is a baseless personal vendetta. My client, Mr. Hartman, has suffered defamation from false accusations made by his estranged daughter and a discredited clerk. These so-called evidentiary materials are illegally obtained and compromised." He paused, letting the words hang like poison in the air. "We move to dismiss the motion in full." Noah stood, his voice steady but sharp. "Your Honor, integrity isn't a matter of convenience. We have direct evidence linking Judge Cole and Charles Hartman through illicit financial transactions and falsified court documents." Judge Sandoval adjusted her glasses. "Proceed." Noah handed over Exhibit A, the notarized original will. This document bears authentic signatures and witness verification. It directly contradicts the version filed under Judge Cole's supervision. She flipped through the pages, brows knitting. "Exhibit B," Noah continued, "is the ledger recovered from Margaret Avery's personal effects, detailing a pattern of payments from Hartman Construction to the Civic Development Fund, a fund later traced to Judge Cole's brother-in-law." A ripple moved through the audience. Delaney sprang up. "Your Honor, these are coincidental business transactions, not evidence of misconduct." Noah didn't miss a beat. "Then, let's move to Exhibit C, an email titled Avery Estate Adjustment, dated 2 days before Mrs. Avery's death. It references pre-approval of estate redistribution and a completed payment from Hartman Construction." Judge Sandoval looked up sharply. "Pre-approval, before probate filing, yes, Your Honor." The silence that followed was deafening. My father shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. Grace Holloway entered the courtroom next, escorted by a marshal. Her hands trembled, but her gaze was steady. She took the witness stand, took her oath, and sat down. "Miss Holloway," Noah began gently, "can you describe your role in Judge Cole's office?" "I was his senior clerk for 5 years," she said. "I processed case filings and drafted procedural orders under his supervision." "And during that time, did you witness irregularities?" She swallowed hard. "Yes. I was ordered to destroy the original Avery will and replace it with a digital copy Cole gave me. I refused, but the next morning my credentials were revoked. I was reassigned and later resigned." Gasps filled the room. Delaney stood, feigning indignation. "Your Honor, this witness has an axe to grind. She's a disgruntled former employee with no physical proof." Grace's voice shook, but she didn't back down. "I saved backups of the forged document. They're timestamped. I turned them over to Mr. Grant and Miss Hartman last month." Noah submitted them. Judge Sandoval examined the files in silence, her face unreadable. Next came Harold Stone. The retired lawyer shuffled to the stand, clutching his affidavit. "Mrs. Avery trusted me to safeguard her original will," he said. "She suspected interference. I didn't speak up because I thought no one would believe me." "Do you recognize these documents?" Noah asked. Harold nodded. "Every page. They match what Margaret signed in my presence." When he stepped down, the room seemed to hold its breath. Noah stood again. "Your Honor, integrity is the foundation of our courts. When that foundation rots, everything built on it collapses. The evidence is clear. Judge Cole acted outside the law, and Mr. Hartman enabled it for personal gain." Judge Sandoval turned to Delaney. Counsel Delaney rose, forcing a smile. "Your Honor, these wild allegations border on conspiracy theory. My client is a respected businessman. He has donated millions to civic causes, including this courthouse." That slip, the arrogance of money, hung in the air like smoke. Before Noah could respond, Judge Sandoval's clerk entered through the side door, whispering something into her ear. The judge nodded, her expression darkening. "It seems there's one more piece of evidence," she said. "A recording submitted anonymously to the Ethics Committee this morning." A screen descended from the wall. The courtroom lights dimmed. Then the recording began. Cole's voice unmistakable, low and irritated. "Tell Hartman the revisions are complete. The daughter won't challenge it. She doesn't have the stomach for a fight." The sound of my father's voice followed, colder, steadier. "Good. Make sure it's filed before she sees it." Margaret always did have too much faith in rules. A collective gasp filled the room. Cole's face drained of color. My father went rigid, his composure cracking at the edges. Judge Sandoval banged her gavel once, sharp enough to silence the whispers. "This court finds sufficient grounds for immediate recusal and investigation. Judge Cole is hereby suspended pending inquiry. All prior rulings related to the Avery estate are vacated." My father stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. That recording could have been fabricated." I rose too, facing him across the aisle. "Then sue me for the truth." He looked at me with something between rage and disbelief. "You think this is victory? You've destroyed our name." "No," I said quietly. "You did." For the first time in my life, he didn't have a response. When the hearing adjourned, the reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs exploded, questions shouted from every direction. "Miss Hartman, how does it feel to expose your own father? Is it true you uncovered decades of judicial corruption?" I stopped only once, turning toward the cameras. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honoring a woman who believed truth still matters. Noah guided me through the crowd to the courthouse steps. Grace caught up with us, tears in her eyes. "You did it," she said. "You really did it." I looked at her, then at Noah. "We did it. All of us." As we walked away, I caught a glimpse of my father inside the building, standing alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. His reflection in the glass doors looked smaller than I remembered, just a man stripped of the power he once wore like armor. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds. For months the world had felt gray and heavy, but now it glowed with a clarity I hadn't known since my grandmother died. Noah handed me the final court copy of the ruling. "For the record," he said with a faint smile. I folded it carefully, tucking it into my bag. "For her," I said. As we descended the courthouse steps, the noise faded behind us. The air smelled of rain and possibility. For the first time, I felt the weight of justice, not as punishment, but as peace. And when I whispered her name to the wind, Margaret Avery, I swore I could feel her beside me, smiling. The morning light in Tacoma feels softer than it used to. Maybe it's just me. The war inside my chest has finally gone quiet. I stand in my grandmother's townhouse, now restored, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor she once polished herself. The oak chest sits open in the living room, no longer a secret weapon but a relic of truth. Inside are her photographs, medals, and the leather-bound journal that started it all. It's been 2 weeks since the hearing, 2 weeks since Judge Cole's suspension and my father's silence. I still half expect my phone to buzz with another threat or legal notice, but instead it's just quiet. Real, clean quiet. I breathe it in like something I haven't tasted in years. On the mantel, a newspaper headline catches the light. Judge Cole faces federal investigation. Hartman Construction under audit. My father hasn't made a public statement. Delaney withdrew from his firm. Grace is safe under protection now, and Harold's name has been cleared. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar, it simply endures. I make coffee in my grandmother's chipped blue mug, the one she used every morning when she'd say, "Truth has its own rhythm, Liv. You just have to outlast the noise." I used to roll my eyes. Now I understand. Later that morning, I walk into the public defender's office for the first time since my suspension. The old fluorescent lights hum overhead. My boss Liam greets me at the door, arms crossed, but there's a smile behind his usual skepticism. You caused quite a storm, Hartman, he says. Guess I needed to remind people we still believe in the law. He chuckles. You did more than that. You reminded us why we started. When I pass through the bullpen, a few of my coworkers glance up from their desks. Some nod, some smile quietly, and one of the younger attorneys whispers, "That's her." For a moment, I feel something like belonging, a strange, gentle kind of pride. Outside, the world keeps moving. Other families have come forward now, bringing their own stories of cases Cole handled unfairly. Reporters call it the Avery effect. Grace testifies before the ethics board, her voice steady, despite everything she's lost. Harold volunteers as a consultant for the review panel, his name once again spoken with respect. I drive back home in the rain, thinking about the ripple my grandmother started. The fight she began with ink and patience, the one I finished with fire and faith. That night, Noah stops by. He looks exhausted, but his smile is easy. You should see the messages coming in, he says, holding up his phone. Families from other states, people who were silenced by corrupt judges. They're asking for guidance. I pour him coffee and sit across from him at the kitchen table. Then maybe it's time to do something bigger. He raises an eyebrow. Bigger? I'm starting a foundation, I say. The Margaret Avery Foundation for Judicial Integrity. It'll fund legal aid for victims of bias and corruption. I'm naming the first program the Lantern Project. Noah nods slowly. Winter lantern, he murmurs. Your grandmother's phrase. She hid truth like a light in the cold, I say. Now it's time to carry it forward. A week later, I stand at a podium in a small community hall, filled with folding chairs and faces full of hope. Reporters, law students, retired clerks, even a few of my old clients all here, because they believe in something again. I tell them about Margaret Avery, the librarian, who became a whistleblower without ever saying a word. I tell them that justice isn't a guarantee, it's a commitment, a daily difficult choice. The smallest light, I say, still changes the room. Applause fills the air, soft but growing until it feels like a heartbeat. When I look toward the front row, I see Noah and Grace clapping. Harold nods from the back, eyes glistening. And for a second, I swear I feel her too, my grandmother, standing beside me, proud and quiet as ever. Weeks pass, and I almost feel normal again. Until a letter arrives. No return address, just my name, written in familiar handwriting. My father. I sit at the window as I read. Olivia, I won't justify what I did. Power made me believe I could rewrite truth. You reminded me I couldn't. I used to think strength meant control, but maybe it's what you showed me in that courtroom, courage. I can't undo what I broke, but I see it now. You won. It's not an apology. Not really. But it's something. I fold the letter carefully and place it in the oak chest next to my grandmother's journal. Let the past rest, I whisper. It's done. Spring arrives quietly. The cherry trees bloom outside the townhouse and the air smells of new beginnings. I drive to the cemetery one bright morning carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. Her headstone looks softer in the sunlight. Margaret Avery, librarian, veteran, mother, truth keeper. I kneel beside it, brushing away a few fallen petals. It's over now, I tell her. Cole's facing charges. Grace is safe. Noah's opening his own firm. And the foundation, your foundation, just approved its first case. I pause, smiling. You were right. Truth always finds its way home. From my pocket, I take the brass key, the one that opened her secret compartment all those months ago. I lay it gently on the stone. You don't need it anymore, I whisper. The lock's gone. When I stand, the wind picks up, scattering petals through the grass, carrying the scent of lilacs and rain. It feels like her goodbye, or maybe her thank you. 6 months later, the world looks different. The headlines have changed. Cole is awaiting trial, and my father's empire is crumbling under federal review. The Avery Foundation funds 3 major cases of judicial misconduct. Law schools invite me to speak about ethics and courage. Sometimes I catch myself standing in front of the chest again, tracing the carved roses on its lid. It's not just an heirloom anymore. It's a symbol of everything she believed, that truth doesn't die when people do. It waits. On quiet nights, I sit by the window with a cup of tea watching the lights across the city. Somewhere out there, another woman is fighting to be heard. Another daughter is discovering that silence isn't safety. And maybe, just maybe, she'll find this story and believe she can win too. If you've ever been silenced or made to believe your truth doesn't matter, remember what my grandmother taught me: the smallest light still changes the room. What would you have done if it were your family? Would you have walked away or fought back? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe stories like this still matter, stay with me. There are more to tell about justice, redemption, and the strength it takes to stand alone. Subscribe, keep watching, and never forget, sometimes the light wins.